Everyone loves attention. Everyone loves being in the spotlight. And everyone certainly loves to be heard at the table, virtual or otherwise. But sometimes, you have that player or game master who makes everything about themselves. From the plot, story, and activities, they center the entire story and narrative on themselves and never want to give spotlight to the other players or even the game master. If you have a player or GM who's doing this, then my friends, you might have someone infected with main character syndrome. So today, Dr. Bloody Disposition is going to be talking about what is main character syndrome and how you can avoid it in your next D&D or TTRPG. So, you do indeed have a character or player or GM who is infected, quote unquote, by main character syndrome, but you don't even know what that is. Well, main character syndrome is where a character clearly stands out as, quote unquote, the main protagonist. They make themselves the hyper-focus of everything and never see themselves, character or player-wise, doing any wrong. Main character syndrome usually forces the player and character to put spotlight on themselves without care of the others at the table. And I think main character syndrome is different than having a character that has a high ego or large in self-importance, or a character with wit or influence who thinks highly of themselves. Those are character flaws. Main character syndrome is a player flaw, which can be negative in some circumstances. In fact, main character syndrome isn't inherently bad. It's only really bad in games with multiple people or games that you have to share the spotlight with others. In solo RPGs or a one-shot, it's okay to be a little bit more focused on main character syndrome or to have some players with it in short bursts. However, main character syndrome is really bad, I think, for games that are long-form campaigns, actual plays, or group-based games, because those player flaws or GM flaws take away from the community aspect of TTRPGs as a whole. Taking the spotlight away from other characters is just not fun, because everyone wants to be seen and heard at the table. When you as a player or GM does that, then it gives no incentive for the player or the GM to continue playing or running the game. If main character syndrome continues onward in your game, this can lead to animosity at the table and even fighting amongst the players because no one's getting what they want. No one's having the spotlight they deserve, and no one's able to invest time and effort into the character, worlds, and plots that you're creating together. However, I do think there are some signs that we can pay attention to when looking at main character syndrome. Some general ones include, but are not limited to, pre-planned stories, / an entire story is already planned for this character. This forces the GM to craft everything, experiences, plots, NPCs around this one PC's backstory, rather than creating NPCs, worlds, and everything else around the characters and around the GM's own personal experiences and interests. Or your character wants to be involved in every single plot element that the GM throws at them, even other characters and other player characters' plot elements. For example, maybe you're playing a Cyberpunk Red character and your hacker character has a plot about them trying to take down a big corporation, but your hacker character also has a plot thread with the other PCs as well as with every other single NPC, and wherever you go, your character's entire focus is always on them, and even other characters' plots focus in on your character. Another example is creating a sole villain without any input from other players, or focusing on your own personal story arc rather than the group activities. And while there is nothing wrong with having a personal story arc in your TTRPG, if that is the only thing that you focus on with no other input from the other players, then that's a problem. Another is where the player character has a special weapon and it's the entire focus and removes the attention from other characters, or, which leads into other really bad player tropes, it's the misunderstood misanthropic outcast. You know, the edgy rogue, the character that doesn't work well with others and is kind of a loner and doesn't interact with any other PC aside from themselves. That's generally a sign that this character and the player themselves are probably infested with the main character syndrome. And a final example is where the player constantly interrupts other players because they see their own story as far more important. And let me be clear, I care about my own characters a little bit more than I do the other player characters on my table, obviously because I have the most investment in my own character versus, say, my friends. But the difference is that I understand that everyone deserves to have spotlight at the table. Not everyone else does. But why does this happen exactly? And I often think it's prominent of new players and GMs. It's those who pull largely from video games, movies, novels, anime, or comic books. Media where main characters are usually one singular person where the plot revolves around them, or they create the plot around them. Which is usually a problem because TTRPGs are social games. Everything revolves around you and your group, unless it is a solo RPG. It could also be a matter of social etiquette. Not all nerds and folks who are new or old to TTRPGs are good at social etiquette, and some cultural boundaries might exist. Players from Japan, players from France, and players from the US, and players from Mexico are all going to have different cultural and social etiquettes because of their backgrounds and because of where and how they grew up. Also, it could be that the character has no focus. Maybe this is a new world player, but they don't understand the mechanics or how to create a character, so they base it off of, well, whatever main character they're thinking of in their favorite fiction. This character has no purpose or no focus, and so they focus the attention on themselves while realizing that this is about collaborative storytelling. So, how do we avoid or deal with this issue? Well, firstly, I think the best way to do this is to not solve this in-game. Out-of-game issues should be solved out-of-game rather than via in-game solutions. For example, you have a elf that's being an entire spotlight hog. Instead of killing this character off or giving them insufferable consequences, pull the player off to the side and tell them how you feel. Communicate that with the other players, and depending on the situation, maybe get the other players involved. You do not want to solve this in-game. Solving this in-game can damage your game credibility and not actually address the problem. Approach the issue directly or with the desired attention depending on the person who is causing the problem. Number 2, bring this issue up / concern up at session 0 to make sure that there's a fair warning for whatever consequences might happen. Let your players know you'd rather not have someone who constantly focuses the game on themselves or is entirely self-indulgent. If you set the boundary early on, players can be aware to not do this, so when it does come up, they can hold themselves responsible and you don't need to have to explain this rule to them again. Now, obviously some people listen and some people don't, so this is on a case-by-case basis. Number 3, inquire why might the player be doing this. What is their reasoning? Listen to them, and from there, take appropriate actions depending on the situation. Maybe the player is not being engaged adequately. Maybe they want a specific kind of game. Maybe a player joined into this game thinking they're going to get tactical combat and really crunchy gameplay, but instead they're getting a lot of fluffy narrative and a lot of social encounters and a lot of noir gameplay. There is a conflict of interest, so you as the GM need to figure something out. The similar sense can be for a GM. Maybe the GM wanted to run a combat heavy game, but they're focusing on only combat-oriented characters. You as the player can voice your concerns and see what you can do about it. Number 4, reward your players for being good sport. GMs, if you confront a player and see that they have made adequate changes to behavior, tell them positive affirmations, compliment them, and show them words of endearment. There's nothing greater than hearing from a GM that you're doing a great job and that you're having fun. Sometimes all you need to hear is that you're having fun and that you're all making this experience more fun for each other. And finally, number 5, let the other players know that they should be aware of this behavior and to try to avoid it as well. Have a heart-to-heart. Say what you feel and express your frustrations before the game, during the game, and even after the game so that you don't have difficult conversations later on when people's feelings are hurt or when people aren't feeling like they're being heard. But depending on the player, maybe don't single them out in a group. Different people hold criticism differently, so try to address to your players or friends directly, and with others, you might want to address with them as a group. In conclusion, when in doubt, address this with the player or the GM who's enabling or performing this behavior. And if they choose not to change their behavior, then it might be best that you pick up the handle of being a GM yourself, or maybe you find a new game. In fact, I think a quote kind of perfectly summarizes what the main character syndrome is and what it does to your game. Open quote. D&D, and other TTRPGs, is an ensemble/troop game and a collaborative storytelling experience. True collaboration is a partnership of equals, and being part of an ensemble means giving up the spotlight sometimes so that others can shine. No one wants to have the spotlight taken out from under their feet, so you shouldn't do to other players, and nor should a GM. However, I understand why it happens. This happens in part because people haven't established boundaries. However, one way I know we can fix this is by setting safety tools for your RPG. And in fact, if you want to learn more about safety tools, which you should because you are awesome like that, then I have a video about safety tools over here. So go check that out so you can fully understand how to avoid this issue.